All right, and welcome to Now This Is Podcasting. I'm your host, Connor, and I'm here with Calvin.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And we are continuing our, this is part 2 of our Pan's Labyrinth kind of review and analysis and just kind of discussion on this Guillermo del Toro film.
Yeah, and so we spent a lot of time mentioning in the first part about how we had problems with this movie and ways that we think that could be better. But what we're going to start with this section 2 is what this film does give us in terms of symbols and themes and our main interpretation of what actually is there. So the main one here, I would say, is that the idea of fairy tales as escapism, especially like concerning Ofelia. So Ofelia obviously loves books and fairy tales, and the parallel aspects of the fairy tale elements to the real events allow us to read this film as a story of a child approaching the harsh reality of her life by putting herself into a fairy tale world. And so these are the ways that you can look at all of the fairy tale, mystical, magical elements, and why we read it that way. So first of all, you do have the that little story at the beginning that she's telling to her brother.
This might be the most weird scene I've ever seen.
Yeah.
But it's also a wonderful transition.
Yeah. Well, and not only that, it was something completely different.
Right.
When he first read it, it was actually, it was supposed to be a parable about a blue rose and a dragon guarding it. And apparently it was a big deal thematically for the story, but Del Toro cut it because it was going to be so expensive.
Right.
So, and I guess more screen time. I don't know. I mean, it's already a 2-hour film. I don't think that screen time should be a concern here.
Yeah. But we're talking about the Rose on the Mountain. Ofelia kind of telling the story to her unborn brother. Yeah,
and so the main takeaway is that the rose is at the top of the mountain, but it's covered in thorns, and men would prick themselves. So men talked of their pain and their fear of dying, which were the thorns, but never the promise of eternal life. And so the rose wilted, which just doesn't mean anything here, which is unfortunate. Like, it's kind of like, it feels like it could be something, but it's not connected to anything other than maybe at the end with like the sacrifice for goodness or justice. But that's a really loose interpretation.
Right. I like to think the baby fetus is just the big inspiration for the BBs in Death Stranding. That's just all I ever thought of when I watched it after playing that game and then seeing that scene. I was like, oh, I get it now.
That's so funny.
That's what it looks like.
That shot is also important too, because the toad then parallels the toad under the tree parallels Carmen's troubled pregnancy. So you do have that shot of the fetus, right? So when Ofelia is telling the baby the story, we get the shot of the fetus in the womb. We travel through the birth canal the same way Ofelia does. So the fetus's position in frame mirrors the shape of the toad's tunnel and his position in it as well. So Del Toro is creating a visual analogy consciously for those paying attention, but subconsciously for those who don't notice it. And it doesn't really matter if you do or don't notice it, because it's working on the same level either way. It's creating a visual connection between these two elements.
And the toad then vomiting that ball symbolizes the actual birth of the baby.
I have no idea.
I don't think so.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what is the key now? Like, I guess that's how we knew it was going to be a baby boy, is because it had a key, and that's a penis for Freudian terms. I don't know. Who knows?
I had maybe a take that the toad in the tree was symbolizing someone who has a lot of greed and is like hoarding wealth at the detriment to everyone around it. So it's like the toad is, eating all these bugs, and I don't really know how that works. I don't understand how it's killing the tree, but it is.
Yeah, right. You think that like eating the bugs would most of the time like a tree doesn't care about bugs unless it's like beetle kill or something like that. So that would actually be helpful.
We're just told that the toad is killing the tree. And so I guess that idea of, someone hoarding wealth or whatever to the detriment of the tree or whatever, there was like that kind of connection you could make too. I don't know what you thought of that, or if you took that away, or if it's just the pregnancy.
I think it's just the pregnancy, because then you do have the Pale Man, and the Pale Man can be seen more as Vidal in his storehouse, because we get there through a portal, and we're getting a key from it. So again, it's connection of keys to the storehouse, keys from the Pale Man. We're just like Mercedes stealing the other copy of the key from Vidal so that the rebels can get into the storehouse. You have the Pale Man. It's really the idea of stealing from a tyrant, because his things wouldn't be missed, because he just has a mass of wealth. And so that's what I think that what's going on there. So I don't remember if Ofelia had seen the storehouse, but I think because Mercedes had, and we consider those characters kind of connected by spirit rather than actual and like analogy. That's the way you can look at it. But Del Toro also calls this an allegory for the Catholic Church, like especially at the time, because this is set in 1944. The Spanish Church like didn't care about the rebels. Like the priest at the dinner table even says, God's already saved their souls. He doesn't care about their bodies. They can die for all I care.
Which is such a brutal thing for a man of God to say.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But he also that's also why the pale man eats children, is because it's a criticism of the Catholic Church, literally preying upon children.
Yeah, no, I definitely, it's so like, it's also like visually horrifying because there's like all the pile of like children's shoes set off to the side of the table. The whole scene is gross.
Yeah.
Whether it's literally what you're saying or metaphorically what it means, that's a tough one to get through. If you want to take it as like, a criticism of the Catholic Church, I like to think of the table as, the Catholic Church is incredibly wealthy and they have this great bounty, but I like to think of it as the idea of like only the church leadership has access to this bounty, and just the regular people like Ofelia, they're not allowed to touch the table. They can't they can't eat from it. They can't have that wealth either. So I like that idea too, is just the mass wealth that the Catholic Church has, but it's also like, oh, but this isn't for the regular people. It's for us.
Yeah. And there's also the idea of like, this doesn't matter thematically, but why did Ofelia eat from the table? I mean, it was because she ruined her dress the night before and got sent to bed without eating.
Yeah, right.
So,
dude, she also picks the biggest grapes I've ever seen in my life. They look amazing.
They look more like plums.
They're huge.
Yeah. And like, it's weird that she chose those out of everything else on the table. I thought there were things that were like a lot more, I don't know, tasty. But I'm not really a grape guy.
No, but again, that whole scene, and we talked about the bites that the pale man's taking out of the fairies. I think one thing that's so interesting about that is do they not all sound like a boo from Aladdin?
Literally. Oh, you know what? We forgot to mention that the fairies are actually Del Toro wanted to think of them as like dirty little monkeys.
Oh, well, he nailed it.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, that's like, oh, you can totally hear it in the sound design.
Oh, they sound exactly like the squeaky sounds that a boo makes. I kept hearing Aladdin in my head.
Yeah, like,
yeah.
Oh, yeah, exactly. That scene specifically, you can really hear the sound design. There are some other parts that you can hear them, but that one especially, because they're all exclaiming. So there, that's kind of what we think of as the pale man, the analogy there. And then you also have the mandrake. So the 2 drops of blood that she has to put into the bowl of milk with the mandrake mirrors the 2 drops of medicine from the doctor at the beginning for Carmen and her pregnancy, to help her with that.
Right.
And so it's interesting comparing the idea of magic and medicine here, because the authority of who suggested it holds different meaning for Carmen and Ofelia, equal weight of belief, but in perfect opposition as to the true remedy. So it's really like a childlike approach to like, well, this is magical, and magic is stronger than anything in the world. So I think, so again, like the 2 drops there are very important. And then we have the Faun. And so this is really important. Like we've mentioned in part 1, that this is not Pan. The movie title was changed from El Labyrinth del Fauno to some version of Pan's Labyrinth, to draw in more of the Western audience. Unfortunately, that also changes our perception of him, because Pan is a sexually voracious trickster god. So anybody that's aware of Pan coming to this film would look at him like that. And it's very odd then that he's nice at first, kind of. I mean, if we think of him as a trickster, those types of things. But
it's interesting that you bring that up, because I think my freshman year I took a mythology class, and we watched this as like one of the last classes. And I think it's just because the teacher liked this movie, but he wanted us to use like, think of this as like, how does this operate as a myth? And that was one of the things he brought up. He was like, think about the archetypes that these different characters have, and kind of the one that most people came up with was the Faun as a trickster, instead of like kind of that mentor father figure, which, because I think that kind of lends to kind of how odd this character is used in the movie, because he feels trustworthy, he feels like he's doing the right thing, but then he also, it seems to have like a nefarious or a purpose trying to meet his own means. And so I do like him as the trickster But then it doesn't play out in the end that way. So
Yeah,
it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it absolutely doesn't work. But yeah, Del Toro has even stated in the interviews that it's a good thing that Ofelia didn't actually meet the real Pam, because she would have been in a world of trouble.
Right.
But I think the Faun represents, Earth, nature. He's a father figure that wants to help her and take her away to someplace beautiful. And so his actions are based on the information given to her. This is why I think that this is why this isn't real, is because he becomes a much different character when Ofelia is told that Fauns shouldn't be trusted. Suddenly he's creepy, impatient, and prone to anger, similar to Vidal. And so I think of him as an animus projection. So of her own subconscious. So a collection of all the male traits she's observed in her life, the kind-heartedness of her dead father and the self-serving anger of her new stepfather. That would explain why he seems like such a weird character in his actions. And it helps if he is not actually real and is just a character that she has made up in her mind.
I like that take a lot. The idea that he could represent the two kind of father figures that she has now, or has had and has currently. I like that idea a lot. That makes his character make more sense because he's so confusing. Super interesting, but very confusing in how he's used in this story.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think that is really a warranted take, because there are too many things in a narrative sense that don't work here. But the other part of what this film is I think that's the heart of it, is like fairy tales is escapism, but then you have this rebel subplot that makes everything a fairy tale of disobedience. So it's Ofelia disobeying, her mother, getting her dress dirty, and then you have her disobeying the Faun, like because she didn't immediately complete the second trial, so he's impatient with her. She ate the grapes from the table, and she didn't give him her brother at the end, and that's compared and contrasted to the rebels. Fighting against fascism, the doctor killing the captive by injecting, so he doesn't give up any more information, and then Mercedes, cutting Vidal's mouth.
I have such an interesting bit of behind the scenes thing on that scene. He gets his mouth cut open. Mercedes cuts his mouth, and then in a later scene, he's suturing it shut. So that's actually a practical effect. I mean, a little piece of makeup they put on over his cheek, and then they painted his skin underneath it blue. That way in post they knew what to paint out. Ooh. And then he actually takes a real suture and sews the prosthetic shut.
Wow.
Yeah, like the Sergei Lopez, like that's not like a fake needle or anything like that. And there's some like cleaning up on the edges with CGI and everything, but there is a prosthetic on his face that he's sewing shut there. I think it's just an amazing bit of a practical work, and then like to have an actor who's willing to like go through and like pull that off. I think it looks awesome.
Yeah, I love that. Like, there's so many things that Del Toro like starts with that as being practical and then makes CG.
Right.
I think it lends a huge amount of realism to his magical nature, the magical nature of his films.
This movie is sneaky in how good the effects are. I don't think you would look at this and be like, wow, like what a triumph of visual effects, or what a triumph of practical effects. This movie is rife with that kind of stuff, and I think it's really sneaky in that way, because it's not like your big box office blow 'em up CGI everywhere kind of movie, but it's really neat in that way.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, but so we've established this idea of fairy tales as escapism, and this idea as a fairy tale of disobedience. This is where we really get to the problem of this film. It is two competing storylines that are only loosely tied together thematically, but they're wildly different in tone and pacing and emotion. This should be a story about Ofelia, and it's set up to be that way, but we also have all of the rebels, and that's given so much screen time and so many characters that we have to consider it on the same level as Ophelia's story, but there's enough screen time to actually flesh out the characters or care about them.
That is at the top of my list of problems with this. I think there's so much time spent on Vidal in this subplot, I hesitate to even call it a subplot. They're both like A plots. That's how the movie treats it. They're both like supposed to be narratives that we care about. Mm-hmm. But oh my God, every time we go away from Ofelia and like the Faun and that story, it is insanely boring to me. It doesn't capture you the same way like this weird fairy tale captures you. It's like, but you can't have two stories competing with each other. One is infinitely more interesting, and then you're drugged down by one that is like, okay, now we have to get through these couple scenes so I can get back to the good stuff, you know?
Right. And so you have the flatness of all of the characters. All of the characters are flat except for maybe the Faun. But you have all of these questions in the first in her storyline, or Ophelia's storyline, like what is magic, like what's real, what does he really want? What is going to happen? And then you have no questions about that for plot B, because this guy's evil, these guys are good, and they're fighting the good fight.
Yeah, there's no. That's why that needs to exist is a smaller B plot, because there's no nuance to that story. Like, we know who Vidal is. It's set up in the first scene, and then it doesn't matter really what the rebels causes. If you're just against the most evil guy ever, like, you're the good guy now. And so there's nothing to be gained except for that to be just a backdrop to your fairy tale, which is, in my like, I think the most simple take of this movie is that this is just supposed to be Ofelia escaping from a bad situation through fairy tales. That's
Right.
what I think this movie it's what it really should be. It's what it really just is. But it is trying to mix the two storylines too much, and they just don't mesh in that way.
Yeah, and so then you have the Vidal set up as the antagonist for both Ofelia and for the rebels. So he's the pivot point to connect these two storylines, and that makes him the central character, which is, you know, it takes away from everything that makes Pan's Labyrinth special. So that's 30 minutes at least of screen time that we could that's actively sucking the life out of the magic of this movie.
Oh yeah, you could not have said that better. Saying that Vidal is the pivot point, because he's the bad guy for Ofelia and he's the bad guy for Mercedes. Which, to me, that's really the two storylines that are going on. You're following Mercedes and the rebels, and you're following Ofelia and her fairy tale. And the fact that Vidal is the bad guy for both of them, it makes him, yeah, like you said, the central character for the movie.
Yeah,
which is terrible.
Exactly. And so on the other hand of that, you have the Faun. And the Faun is so frustrating because we've mentioned it before, like, his narrative role is at odds with his thematic role if we consider this a film to be a fairy tale of disobedience. If we consider his narrative role to be the archetypal old man, the guide to the underworld, friend of Moana, then why does he have these mood swings? Why is he helpful, then menacing, then helpful, then asks for the blood from a baby?
Right.
Yeah, like thematically, the whole movie is about questioning authority or authoritarians. The doctor's defiance by killing the prisoner, like, that's because some men cannot blindly follow orders. Is the clearest example of all of these characters righteously disobeying.
I love that line. That whole scene with the doctor is wonderful.
Yeah,
he's like you're the only kind of man who's like that. Like,
yeah, and it's just like a huge slap in the face.
yeah, and then just walking out, like,
knowing he's gonna die.
Yeah, that's a wonderful, like, really like dying for a just cause scene, you know?
Yeah, exactly. But fairy tales are generally not about disobedience. Fairy tales are generally about obedience. Like, that's the whole point. Like we mentioned before in the story of Icarus, don't fly too high so the sun doesn't melt your wings, the wax on your wings. Don't fly too low, or the waves will take you. It's all about, like, it's codifying the middle ground, so that you're not deviant and you fit into society. So her disobedience by eating from the pale man's table is directly opposed to this theme of disobedience, because even if the pale man is Vidal and it's a metaphor for raiding the storehouse, this is a completely different situation where the consequences of her disobedience would hurt her and her fairy friends. You can say that the rebels had similar risks in raiding the storehouse, but they also risked dying in the woods from exposure. So this wasn't a needless risk on their part. In a fairy tale sense, the gruesomeness of the fairies being eaten said that she made the wrong choice. It's akin to I'm sorry, I guess I hadn't mentioned Icarus before, but it's akin to the hubris of Icarus, flying too high because he thought the rules didn't apply to him.
Right. I like that idea, because you can't just have Ofelia be like an allegory for everything that's going on with the rebel cause, because it just doesn't fit together with the story. So she can't represent the rebels inside the pale man's dining room. She can't, it just doesn't fit all together in that way. You know what I mean?
I think it could be. I think that's what he was trying to go for. But, like, her disobedience here is about selfishness, not because
Yeah.
it's just not because she's not blindly following orders. Like she's being childlike.
Yeah, which is which narratively doesn't fit at all with the idea of the rebels raiding the storehouse. Like,
Yeah.
in an altruistic way. She didn't take grapes off the table to be altruistic, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So what this ultimately means is that the film tries to make the Faun work the same way that Vidal does with the rebels. He's an authority figure that might not be trustworthy, should be questioned, but the Faun is very helpful and seemingly cares with nuance that Vidal does not possess in any way, shape, or form. It's obvious that Vidal should be distrusted because he's evil. The Faun's ambiguity for motivation, though, prevents this comparison and breaks us into two separate movies thematically, accentuating the fact that the two plot lines work against each other.
That definitely lines up with another one of my problems. I think if you want to have those two stories, you need to have the Faun and Vidal parallel each other, like in a much more obvious way. Because I think there are some elements built into that. Like if you want to look at Ofelia and Mercedes as kind of essentially being the same sort of character, Mercedes is forced to carry out tasks like cooking the rabbit or keeping the storehouse locked, or she carries out tasks out throughout the house for Vidal, even though she is working against him. She's doing it kind of against her will. She doesn't want to do it. Then you need to set up the Faun in the same way, and you need to have Ofelia carrying out tasks for the Faun, even though she doesn't really want to. And then you can have those that would parallel Vidal and the Faun in a much more clear way, and then you would have the clear mirroring of Mercedes and Ofelia, which then I think lines up the two narratives in a much more cohesive way.
Yeah, exactly. Like there are a couple ways that this movie would be made better, and one of them is telling the two stories, that of Ofelia and that of Mercedes. But you have to make those parallels clear. So one believes in magic as a form of escape, and that life would be better if magic existed. She can escape into an imagined Alice in Wonderland type experience. And then the other stopped believing in magic, but still believes in goodness and doing the right thing in the face of oppressive evil. In this case, a repressive government. So she believes that she can escape her life of subjection if she creates the country she wants to live in. So it's about creating worlds, about telling the story. Like, then the movie becomes the power of stories, the stories that we tell our children and the stories we tell ourselves. So the childlike belief has place in the adult world. Like, these stories are important because we raise our children to be empathetic individuals that create better futures. So in a really elegant way of tying these things together would be that the idea of bugs and fairies. Like the bug turns into a fairy when Ofelia shows it a picture of the book. And
Right.
You have a bug changing into a fairy.
I wonder, because I think there's two different takes you can have on that. Do you think that the stick bug saw the depiction of a fairy and turned into it because it saw it and it thought that would be something that Ofelia would connect with or resonate with better? Or do you think that it is actually a fairy and it was like, oh, she understands who we are, I can show her my fairy form? I think it works in both of those ways. I think it's interesting.
I mean, if you think of everything as being real, I think that's the case. But I don't think it's everything that's being real. I think she saw a bug, like, oh, what if that's a fairy?
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the way it works. Like, so then you could have Mercedes like communing with bugs as a way of like she doesn't believe in fairies anymore, but they still carry some magical property, like the idealism of life and value in all creatures. So that's a good way of paralleling small changes to this film that would make it infinitely better. You don't really need to get rid of this plot then. You just need to make the themes obvious that they are the same.
Because I think on just a first glance, it is hard to be like, how is rebels against an evil captain the same as Ofelia carrying out tasks for a Faun? It's really hard to just be like, oh, those stories are the same. You know, like you said, I don't think you need to be ambiguous in how you work those two stories to be similar. I think it would help, and I don't think it means that the audience is dumb, because we have talked about movies like before where everything is so spelled out and you need to make it obvious, otherwise people won't get it. But this is the kind of movie where the two narratives are so different, like just the inherent plot of the two, that I think you need to establish a couple points in there to be like, okay, I get the parallels they're making here.
Yeah, exactly. And so I start with that one as one of the most obvious ways to make this movie better, because you really don't need to change a whole lot. But I think an infinitely, again, a much, much better movie is making everything about Ofelia. Tell everything from her perspective while giving glimpses of some of the political tension, but make the whole point of the movie her conflict with her stepfather and her use of fairy tales as a way of dealing with that, because that's the magic. Like I think this is really the heart of Pan's Labyrinth, the wonder of this magical world, the questions about whether any of it's real. Give the movie its character, its aesthetic, and all of its emotion. And so the way you would do that then is you have to make, like you were saying, you have to make Vidal like the Faun, like make the comparisons. They have to both be authoritarians that she doesn't want to listen to. She can then create her own fairy tale about a Faun that represents Vidal and how she overcomes this creature with her wits and magical friends. Like it doesn't need to be real. It can just be like she's writing her own story and how it would play out in an imagined world versus how she wishes it played out in the real world. Or set the Faun up like a caring father figure that ultimately betrays her as a political allegory of like the slow creep of a fascist regime. Then you can work in your more your political criticisms as well. If as long as you keep everything tied loosely in the background.
Right. I think everything about these stories working together is kind of hinges on making a parallel between the Faun and Vidal.
You're absolutely right.
Because I think you could also, we talked about, it would make more sense if Vidal had given her the dress.
Yeah.
And because then maybe that would lead you to believe like, okay, maybe he is caring kind of the same way that the Faun appears to be caring, and he's trying to help her. And if Vidal was doing small things throughout the movie to kind of win Ofelia over, but then he also shows his like true nature and she sees that, then and in the same way you could have the Faun paralleling that too, where he's helping Ofelia along, but then he's also mad that she didn't carry out the second task immediately, and he kind of blows up on her and tells her that she'll never return to the underworld. So I think the whole story works only if those two guys are parallel to each other. And it doesn't matter if you want to pick it one way or the other, whether it's Vidal's really evil and you make the Faun like overly evil, or if you try to blend the two characters. It all only works if they are treated the same, and they're not at all, because the Faun is kind of confusing and kind of seems to move in between the light and the dark, but Vidal is just always evil, and we always know that. And so that's why this doesn't work. Yeah,
exactly. So you can, like, especially like if the Faun had always been really, really helpful up into the point where he asked for the blood from her baby brother, like someone of lesser character, who's, if you have someone that's always told you the truth, has always been helpful and trustworthy, and someone tells you, oh, I just need a couple drops of blood from your baby brother. Someone of lesser character would be like, oh, okay, that's fine. I have no reason to distrust you.
Right.
But someone of a strong character then could resist that because, like, no, I don't want to hurt anyone. But it doesn't mean anything here because we already don't really trust the Faun, because he seems like a very self-serving character who's prone to anger and violence. So it doesn't even matter that. And also, think about like the way the movie actually treats it. It's like, give me your baby brother, and she's like, no. And then Vidal shows up and like, give me the baby, and she's like, okay. Yeah. So it's like it doesn't. So they're not even connected there.
So it's not even treating them the same. I guess maybe you could look at it as like, no matter what, like that animus projection was going to get what it wanted. Like it was going to get the baby no matter what.
Yeah,
you could maybe look at it that way. I'm reaching there.
Yeah,
you should be proud. I used animus projection, and I'm learning. Dude.
And you're making a very good point in my mind.
So one of the things about this movie is that Guillermo del Toro has said that all of the magic is real. All this stuff is happening. And that's a little bone of contention between us. So I think it is real.
I don't think it is. Almost everything can be explained away as being in her head. The Faun is literally invisible in the final scene. So the only thing that can't be explained is how she got to the room with Vidal and her baby brother. The only way that makes it would work is if the chalk actually does open portals through doors. But everything else can just literally be inside of her head.
So I have a quick take on why I think why the Faun isn't seen at the end. So Ofelia has dropped that medication in his glass, and he's kind of woozy and out of it. Mm-hmm. I think that he's just been dosed, and he just can't see the Faun. Because there's like a little tricks of the camera that have been done earlier where he's kind of like wobbling and there's a little bit of distortion in the frame. So I think it's implied that he's clearly impaired. And I just think he walks up and he just doesn't see the fawn. And then the fawn is like disappeared. And it's not even out of the realm of possibility that the fawn is just magical himself and he could make himself unseeable to anyone but Ofelia.
And I don't necessarily find a problem with any of those interpretations. The problem I have then is that you cannot have that shot in the film, because if you have that shot, that reinforces the idea that is not real. That if you cannot see something that someone else does, then that's only happening from their perspective.
I agree with you. That's for me explaining why the magic is real. That's the toughest scene to overcome, because it is so like clear that like she is standing by herself talking to what seems like nobody, and it's so set up in a way that would make it look like a child just talking to an imaginary friend. Like that's how it's set up to look. So it's hard to explain that away. But my only thought is that he's high and he doesn't see the fawn. I wonder if there's maybe a neat trick they could do, or maybe there's a
camouflage. Yeah, like a predator.
Yeah,
like from the
oh, yeah, not quite like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's just kind of shimmering.
But I mean, like maybe there's like maybe he thinks he sees the fawn, or maybe it's like a weird looking tree branch, like because the fawn is built to look like a tree. So maybe there's like some a small tree in there, and he kind of wipes his eyes, and then it's gone. And by that point, the fawn is like already kind of like vanished from the scene. So I think, but then I also think that it's interesting to have the idea of looking at it and being like, what's real and what's not. So regardless of what Guillermo del Toro says, I also think there's really interesting takes on why it's all not real.
Yeah, exactly. And then too, like if another fun thing could have been like you could have had Black Phillip, the goat from The Witch, just like that's what Ofelia is talking to.
Oh God,
man, that would really tie together like two really interesting movies.
Yeah, great cinematic universe in the making.
But yeah, so the examples that Del Toro has actually said in an interview as being real is the Ofelia escaping her bedroom to get to her brother because she has a guard stationed in front of her door, and Vidal even says if anyone tries to get into the room, shoot her first. So literally, like that's only like he's just paying attention to her.
God, this dude sucks.
Yeah, right. Like that's awful. Especially like speaking of awful, like if you have a choice to save her or the baby, save the baby.
Oh my God, I had forgotten about that line.
Isn't that crazy?
He's terrible.
Yeah.
And I think that I think I'd mentioned in part one that I think he really resents Carmen for getting sick.
Yeah.
And now he's just kind of biding his time until she dies. And he never really wanted Ofelia and all this. That's what I'm saying is there's so many character traits that he has that they could have used to build parallels between him and the Faun, and they choose not to. They just choose to make him outright bad guy, which is fine if you want to have a terrible villain for the rebels to unite against. Not very cool and nuanced if you want to tell a cool fairy tale story, you know?
Absolutely, especially when one has nuance. And then the other two things he has are the Labyrinth parting ways to allow her into the center, which, I mean, I think could just be something that happens in her mind, like she sees a way through, you know, like it's like, oh, it's like everything parted to allow me to the center of the labyrinth, and he's drunk and he misses it. Like it could just be like a little opening. Like that's another thing that it's just like it's all from her perspective. He doesn't see it, so it doesn't necessarily need to be magical.
Yeah, no, I get that. I can't take credit for this. This is Hannah's take. She was like, I got real Shining vibes from that scene, like her being chased through the labyrinth, which I totally agree. And that would make sense. I know Guillermo del Toro is described as a cinephile, so I don't doubt that he took a little license or inspiration from Kubrick and threw that kind of in there. It's got similarities to it. I like that. I like that take on it. I told Hannah, I was like, oh, I'm going to steal that.
Right.
But I'll give her cred on that one.
Yeah. And then the last example he gives is really confusing to me because you remember where she leaves her dress on that branch when she goes into the toad lair?
Right.
It shows the bug and there's like a little white flower, and she left in it. The story says like she left her mark for those paying attention. That's what he's talking about. That's the only thing in the film that has her mark of if people know where to look, is that flower, which doesn't mean anything happened. It just means that there's a flower there. Like all of her entire trip to the tree could have been a story, and she just rolled around in the mud somewhere. None of it has to be real still.
I guess I never made that connection. The connection I always made was to the story of the rose on the mountain. And so it talks about the end of that. It's like, everyone was too afraid to get up there and bequeath. It never got to bequeath its gift of beauty. And so I thought that flower on the tree was just supposed to symbolize that she was the flower at the top of the mountain. And she has this story to be told, but no one ever quite made it up to her.
Oh my God. I bet that is. But there's no reason to justify that connection in terms of theme.
I suppose you're right. I feel like for some of this stuff, I feel like I'm reaching, but I think this movie is so interesting in that way. It's like you can throw theories out like that because I like that idea a lot. And granted, it's my idea, so of course I like it. But that's the connection I always made, is that flower is just parallel to the flower on the mountain.
Interesting. I'll allow it.
Thank you.
But then the possible real things is still, if the fawn isn't real, then she's just talking to herself. But the moon birthmark on her left shoulder. Another thing I think is really interesting is some people have given speculative, what the real relationship of the fawn is with her. Maybe he is her real father, Moana's real father, or a friend or a lover. And they use this obelisk when he's explaining, that's me, that's you. And then she asks, who's the child? It's very obviously the foreshadowing of the ending.
Right.
It's them at the end with her baby brother, because she asks, who's the baby? And he just moves on. But some people have speculated that there's some love relationship between them. Especially considering about what the movie originally was, a story where a family moved into this house. They found a staircase behind a bookcase. The woman falls in love with a fawn, and the fawn convinces her to sacrifice their child.
Sounds like a great movie.
Yeah. I mean, it was much darker than this. But that has, I don't think that has, maybe that has some connection to that, and it's just in spirit, but I really think it's just foreshadowing there. And it's interesting, if everything is a projection of her mind and her story, why would she put that in if she literally dies at the end, but she doesn't know that yet?
I always saw that carving as, I think that plays into kind of the misdirect and confusion that the fawn has as a character, because I saw that as he's trying to achieve some nefarious purpose where he's the one with the children, and he's saying that Ofelia is carrying out these tasks for the king and for her to get back to the underworld. And that's why he brushes over the obelisk really quickly, because he's like, oh, no, don't pay attention to that. I'm secretly getting you to do my thing where I get to have you guys, or something like that. Which is, again, that's why the character is so confusing, because that's how I interpreted that. And then he ends up not being that kind of character at all. So I like that idea that if it's from her perspective, then why would she have them all together if she's going to end up dying in the end? That makes a lot of sense. But I also thought that was just put in to make the fawn more interesting, not really to tell a story in and of itself.
Yeah, it still feels like it's in the service of nothing then.
Exactly, which is what I think a lot of this movie is.
Yeah, exactly.
Essentially, so it fits perfectly into this film.
And then one of the other things I think that you can suggest it as being real, it could just be a child making the connection. It's just a coincidence, but when the mandrake gets burned on the fire and suddenly Carmen starts having those really nasty contractions, you can say oh, the remedy isn't working anymore, and that's why. But you could also just say it was just the stress of the situation of the captain being mad at her and seeing her child in distress, and so that's why her contractions are happening. But Ofelia sees it as they're happening because the mandrake is getting burned. So
I agree with you. That's a scene that could easily be taken as being real or not, as being magical or not. Mm-hmm. I totally agree with you with that, because like you said, Ofelia will look at it as being like, oh, you burned the mandrake, that's why you're going into contractions right now. Someone like an adult who doesn't believe in magic looking at that would be like you said, the stress of the situation. So that is, again, that's why I think that this movie is fun in that way, because you could totally look at that at it that way, which is why I think it's odd that Guillermo del Toro came out and said that it is a fairy tale.
It's so strange for a filmmaker to do that in the first place. Most of them won't even give a hint at that, because it kind of cheapens your work, because then everyone knows what you were aiming for. I mean, I don't think it cheapens your work, but it's just here's the standard that I'm holding myself to. And it doesn't work for me then, because if that's what you were trying to do, you did not achieve that, because I think that almost all of these can be explained away. So again, like your themes don't match up and your real world of magic doesn't make sense. So I don't think this movie is very good because it didn't achieve what it set out to do.
Yeah, if that was his goal, is to be like everything's magic, then yeah, it missed the mark on that. I think it's better to leave it ambiguous. Because while I said I do think it is all magic, and I just like the idea of it all being magic, it's fun in that way. I also totally find everything that you're saying to be a totally acceptable reasoning for things to not be real. Mm-hmm. I totally agree with that too. It just depends on what take do you want to have, what makes this movie more fun or more enjoyable for you. And the fact it is a bummer when a director comes out and is like, no, it is this way, that's it. Because then it kind of gets rid of like the fun theories that you can have about a movie when someone just tells you like, no, I made it, I'm in charge of it, this is what I say. But in the end, it doesn't matter. We still get to make this podcast and we get to have our own opinion anyway. So
yeah, exactly. But it's funny that you say that. And like, I feel like when someone makes a really intelligent work of art, like Ari Aster making Hereditary, then coming out and saying that all of the weird things happening were the Coven, suddenly that movie is way, way better, because like, wow, okay, I thought a lot of that stuff was just people being crazy or like weird representational things. This puts it in a completely different perspective, and suddenly it's a much more interesting work, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting how that works, how sometimes a director can come out and like put his foot down on something and you're like, oh, boo. And then sometimes the director will come out and you're like, oh my God, that makes this movie so much better.
But I think that's like the difference being there, like, that was not the point of his film. The point of Hereditary is the family drama and everything else. Like whoever was the real actor behind all of the bad stuff happening to the family, like whether it was just the Coven, whether it was just spiritual, whether it was it doesn't matter what those things are, because you will still receive the film the same way.
You're right. I was trying to come up with in my head, why are they different? Why do they feel different, to get that kind of staple from the director on what's real and what's not? Why do they feel different? And that's exactly it. That's a really good point.
Yeah, and I think so.
That's why you're on the podcast, Calvin.
Yeah, right. But I think the way we wrap up this film is then what the ending means to you and how you interpret the ending. Yeah, why don't you go first?
So I guess I kind of want to start out, does Ofelia die or not? So my thought is that she does die. And I really like the scene a lot where she's laying on the ground and Mercedes has come to kind of comfort her, and you see like that really nice warm like orange light come in and kind of envelop her, and then it moves into like that courtroom with the thrones, like I had mentioned in part one, with the lovely costumes and everything. I just love all that. I think that's just kind of her finally moving on to she's not imagining this fairy tale anymore. She's going to move on to like her heaven. And if the movie is from her perspective and it is magic, it would make sense that she would move on to the underworld like she's supposed to. And she'll have her life there with her mother and her padre and everything. And it makes sense to me for the story to end that way. It is much less fun and much more depressing if if none of the magic is real in that moment. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I think that's the way it is. And the reason I think that is because why would Carmen be her mother in the underworld? There's no reason for her spirit to be reincarnated in this Ofelia character and have the same mother. Like that mother never left the underworld. So she already exists as a different form in the underworld. So why would be a Carmen sitting on the throne would only be that way if Ofelia is finishing her fairy tale, and this is how her subconscious she doesn't have any guilt because she didn't give her brother to the Faun. Which is weird because Vidal still takes it. But
the baby is also in the underworld. Yeah, Carmen is holding a little baby. It's like really shrouded in all that lovely red velvet. But yeah, she's holding a baby, which I guess makes the ending make less sense because the baby doesn't go with her to the underworld.
Yeah. Yeah, I was like, man, I didn't even see the baby. But yeah, like exactly, like if it's all in her head, like she is projecting her real life onto these characters in the underworld who never left. They wouldn't look like the ones that we are familiar with.
I don't think Guillermo del Toro knows that the magic isn't real. I think he made a movie where the magic isn't real and he forgot. because now I'm changing my mind, because now that makes less sense to me. She's seeing her father, who we've never seen on screen before. So I agree that he could look like anything, and that would make sense. But of course, she would see her earthly mother. That's who she would project in this courtroom, and then she would project seeing her brother.
Yeah, because why would the underworld mother have a baby at the exact same stage of life at the exact same time?
Like that ending would lend itself more to it being her imagination, kind of at the end of her life. Like, yeah, okay, I've changed my mind completely. I don't think the magic's real, because I like the idea now of in her last moments, the thing she imagines is everything being perfect and her fairy tale working out.
Yeah, that's the way.
Yeah.
And that's the way I think it is, and that's why I think that this movie the magic of it is fairy tales as escapism, as a way of taking all of the nasty stuff in your real life, putting them into stories, and like why I think that films are empathy games or empathy thought experiments, because once you put them into the framework of a story, you can work through what it means to actually live it. And that's what's happening here. It just sucks that, it's sad at the end, like she ends up dying because this is the way she wishes her life had turned out, but it didn't because of this terrible, awful man.
You got to watch this with someone who's never seen it before. I watched it with Hannah. And just seeing her face during like the bottle smashing scene, and then during Ophelia's death, she was not expecting at all for Vidal to pull out the pistol and smoke Ofelia like that. I turned and looked at her; her mouth was open, her eyes were wide. I was like, "Yeah, it's that kind of movie." And this movie is so tragic and everything, and that's why I like the idea of just having like the rebel kind of battles going on outside as a backdrop. Already lends to the tragic nature, and then the fact that all these fairy tales are told in a really dark way really builds on that. And that's why now I've changed my mind to thinking that her last moments are spent escaping this like dark tragic world she's in with a nice fairy tale ending. Yeah, I like that idea much better.
And it's unfortunately the way that works best. That might be a little bit of like a circle jerk, pat myself on the back, but I feel like that's all the movie gives us.
No, I think you are right, because you changed my mind. And, I like to have my own theories and I'm not going to say like set in my ways or anything, but I like to take my interpretation and bring that to this podcast. And so if you've brought up enough good points that make sense to me, then yeah, of course, I think that the way you've plotted it out narratively makes more sense, I think. There is still a couple of those like little like points, like how does she get out of the room? Yeah, but you can explain that away with sneaking or something. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. You really can. Like she snuck out outside of a window. Like there are windows and things, like maybe there's creaky. Like also if you think of like her getting into the pale man's area, like if that wasn't really a story, but maybe she's crawling around in some crawl space that's like, because it's a really old house, and maybe she's figured out some way to get through the house. It really makes as much sense as everything else that he's given us.
Yeah, so Guillermo del Toro, email us at now this is podcasting100@gmail.com, or comment on our when we upload this on YouTube and let us know if you can rebuttal any of this stuff, and then we'll change our stance. But yeah, I think the way I stand now is I like the idea of it being a fairy tale in her own head. I think that works out really well.
Yeah.
So do you have final thoughts on this one?
I think this movie is so close to being transcendent, because we rarely get real life brutal fairy tales, but these are the characters are either too flat, or they're too nuanced, or they're not connected, and even if all of those things are like, even if you fixed all of those things, this film would be good. Like it's not going to be great for me ever, because Del Toro just doesn't have a good sense of camera work around him. So it's not that great for me. Like I remember watching this and like, wow, this is amazing. And then I saw Shape of Water when that came out, and I was like, wow, this is not really that. This is no Pan's Labyrinth, that's for sure. And then I went back and watched Pan's Labyrinth. It's like, oh shit, it's the exact same.
Yeah, like
the exact same, because there's a completely different plot line with that Cold War espionage. Which, I'm sorry, Connor, you haven't seen that yet. It's the exact same
spoiler,
movie.
Man.
Yeah, it's the exact same movie. Like we completely distract from what the heart of the movie is, and we don't spend enough time cultivating the heart of that movie for it to actually matter. in the end.
I think one thing you can definitely do is watch Kronos and then be like, that's no Pan's Labyrinth. So that's
Yeah, it's like each movie you go back like, well, that's no.
my thought is like, yeah, I think I'm right there. This is almost really, really good. Like there's all the contemporary articles and reviews that are just raving about this movie. And I like, don't get me wrong, I totally get that. Like I think I mentioned in part 1 that I had no problem going back and reviewing this. Like I like this movie. It is different to go at it with like a more critical lens and kind of then pick out all the stuff where I think there's one really interesting plot in this movie, and then it feels like they accidentally edited in a second movie into this, and that it just doesn't work together. Then again, I love the prosthetics. I love the characters that are brought to life by Doug Jones. The Faun is just one of like I think the most neat character designs, and for me, all the fantasy elements that are built up around him and Ofelia, those like really saved the movie. I love every interaction between Ofelia and the Faun. They're all fantastic. I love his kind of sway between. I like his character. He's more interesting because he's confusing in his motive, and the fact that he ends up being kind of servant of the king who was always kind of carrying out that will anyways, in a way kind of ruins that character for me, because I thought he was more interesting until he turned out to just be literally a good guy the whole time. I like his character a little more if he is kind of nefarious in some ways, so I kind of lost a little from him. But even still, I love all that stuff. I love all the practical effects. I love going through and finding out all the cool behind the scenes stuff that went into this movie. So in the end, I still like it, but I realize now narratively there are many more problems with this than I initially realized. But in the end, this is still an enjoyable movie to me. I think it's so fun in a really kind of dark way.
Yeah.
I know that's like weird to say, but I find this movie interesting and I like watching it. And I really like talking about it. This is a good one to pick, especially to stretch out, and I wouldn't even say stretch out, to make a 2-parter, because there's a good bit to mine out of this, I think.
Yeah, especially when it's something like we mentioned in part 1 that on Metacritic it has a 98, and I just can't, I flat can't understand that. It does not meet any of the criteria of a good story, whether or not like you even care about the language of film. So I think there is when we feel so differently about a movie, it's good there to be a 2-parter. But then there's also like movies that everybody are universally loved. Like Hereditary gets rave reviews, and we're like, oh yeah, we love that.
Yeah.
So
how many mandrake roots do you give this one?
I was gonna give it Dirty Monkey Fairies.
Oh, let's do that. I love that. Okay.
It's honestly, it's not very good. It misses a lot of things. It needs a lot of work. It doesn't know what it is. It's honestly, I'm only going to give it a 5.8. There's a lot of great creature design. There's a lot of, you can see so much heart and vision. You can really see like that Del Toro is a visionary, absolutely a visionary. He's just in the wrong medium.
Right.
So it's a 5.8.
I have all the exact same praises that you have. I think the one thing is I am able to look past the shortcomings of it. And that's why I put this at like a 7. I just like watching this so much. But yeah, with that, we'll wrap this one up. You can reach us at nowthisispodcasting100@gmail.com. We also upload all these to YouTube, and you can catch us in the comment section down there. Let us know we did well. Let us know what we're doing wrong. And if you have any suggestions for other films we should watch. This is also uploaded to any platform that you could think of for podcasts, like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And yeah, with that, thank you for listening to Now This Is Podcasting.